Hi, everyone. I am Kate Drabinski, a coach here at Ideas on Fire, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on deciding whether to finish your PhD. And I was excited to talk about this topic because I remember distinctly making an active and conscious decision to finish my dissertation, and it made it a lot easier to finish my dissertation, and if I'd made another choice, would have made it easier to move on. The way this will go is in a second, my face will disappear and the slides will come on screen and I will talk through the presentation for today. And then I will come back to this screen, hello, and say hello to everyone. If you have questions or things you want to discuss with other webinar participants or with me, if you just type them in that screen that's to your right. I see I said on the left of your screen. I'm not good at directions, but right there. We'll get to them after the webinar. So again, I'm excited you're here to join us today, and let's talk about making that decision. All right, just take 1 second. Okay, so again, today this is a webinar on deciding whether or not to finish your PhD. Look at her wandering slowly away as she makes this big decision. So on tap today, we're first going to talk about why we might want to actively decide whether or not to finish. And in order to make that decision, we'll talk through some steps. First, we'll discuss how we got into this mess in the first place, and then how we know whether to stay or go. And then I'll talk through some of the common things that go through our heads when we're making this decision, starting with, do we have to finish since we've come this far, which I think is the sort of the biggest block from ever deciding just to not finish. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we could possibly do instead. And then, if we do decide not to finish it, are we just sort of left out in the ether with nothing to do? And then we'll talk a bit about how to tell people what we've decided either way. And that can be a really tricky thing to tell people, especially our professors, but also our peers and colleagues who will look at us, if we decide not to finish, look at us both with fear that they will become us and also envy that we have made such a big decision. And then I'll end today by talking about places where we can find company. It can be really lonely to decide not to finish. And so we'll talk about how to find people in similar situations. Okay, so how do we get into this mess? I think reflecting on what made us decide to go to graduate school is really, really important to deciding whether or not we want to stay. For a lot of us, we decided to go to graduate school when we were in, just finishing college. So we're maybe 21, 22, 23 years old at the very beginning of sort of big decisions after much of our lives have been mapped out for us up to that point. If we decide to go to graduate school later in life, right, it doesn't mean that what we decided to do is necessarily still something we want to do 4, 5, 6 years in. So think about why you decided to go to graduate school. Was it because you had burning questions that you needed to answer? For a lot of us, this is it. We wrote a senior thesis in college, or we enjoyed some certain classes and we were really excited to keep pursuing those things intellectually. Did we go to graduate school because we were A, students, so we thought, well, let's just keep being students since we're good at this? I think a lot of people who go straight from college to graduate school, this does, if we're being honest with ourselves, describes a lot of why we ended up in grad school. We were good at it. What else are we going to do? Another reason you might have gone to graduate school, and this is increasingly true, I think, is to avoid paying back student loans. You get that deferment as long as you're a student. So I'm a teacher now. I teach at UMBC out in Baltimore, and I watch students to go to master's programs partly so they don't have to start paying back their loans. Is that why you started? And for some of us, we started grad school because we wanted to be teachers in college. We wanted to be just like the teachers who had been inspiring us. So think about why you decided to go to graduate school. And you'll want to check in and see if those things are still true for you. And then think about the things that you didn't know you were getting into. Because I think when we decide to go to graduate school, we rarely understand the full scope of the profession and the expectations and the hoops that we have to jump through to get through graduate school. There's no way to know it until you get there. So here's some things that you might not have known, but you probably are really familiar to now. There's a ton of hoops to jump through: language requirements, course requirements, residency requirements, intro courses, things like that. A lot of hoops, one after another. Did you format this paper correctly? No, sorry, go back. You have another year. For a lot of us, there's unhealthy competition that we weren't expecting when we went to graduate school. I went to UC Berkeley, and as soon as I got there, I realized, wow, it's everyone is extremely competitive and not supportive in the way that I'd experienced as an undergraduate. Did you understand how much writing would be involved? When we are undergraduates, we might have produced one or two longer papers, but did we really understand how much writing and research we are expected to do? Teaching. I know that when I went to graduate school, it was a vague idea that you might be a teacher, but being a TA my second semester was a whole different experience. So were you expecting that as part of the job? And then there are the things that we probably knew going in, but become more and more real as we go through the graduate school process of the terrible job market, right? People probably told you about that. But once you're in graduate school and you're getting near the end, you're dissertating, that becomes a lot more real. How are you going to pay your rent? And how are you going to support the people you support in your life, your children, your parents, your friends, your lovers, people who are part of your community? If you can't get a job, how are you going to have health insurance? If you have a health crisis, where are you going to be? Where are you going to be left? Right. So the job market takes on a different kind of urgency as you reach the end of and look towards your dissertation. And then there's the part that I didn't understand until I was done with graduate school, was the loss of present and future earnings. All the years that you put into graduate school that you're not working at a job, saving for retirement, sort of accruing some of the kinds of wealth that we may be critical of, but also enable new kinds of life for ourselves as grown-ups, right? That loss, the longer we stay in graduate school, the more it extends. So these are issues that start to, I think, change what we see not only about graduate school, but what we understand the profession that we're training for to look like. So that's how we got here. Now, how do we know whether to stay or to go? And I think that it's important to actually write out your reasons for attending graduate school. And even if you can't remember them, like what did you think this job was going to be about? And see which ones are still true and which ones aren't. That part where maybe we go to graduate school and earn the PhD because we've always been good students starts to have less meaning the longer we're in graduate school, right? Because if you're an A student, you'll probably be good at a lot of different kinds of things. The skills of a studentness, of like showing up on time, of being engaged, of completing work, of writing well. These are skills that are applicable, making a student, other things, right? Doesn't mean you have to be in graduate school. But look at which of those reasons for attending are still true. Do you still have those burning questions to answer? That may be a slower burn after all these years of hoop jumping, but is there still something there is there a question that you need to answer? And then actually think about what you find satisfying about teaching. If you've been in a PhD program that allows you to teach, do you really enjoy it? Is it a calling? Does it feed your energy and your intellectual life? Remember that teaching is part of what you'll do if you get an academic job with that PhD. So if you don't enjoy teaching, it's worth thinking about whether or not it's worth finishing. Also, think about what you find satisfying about research. Is it something that you enjoy? That doesn't mean you're going to enjoy it all the time, right? Because a lot of it is a slog, especially when you get towards the dissertation. But is it something you can see yourself continuing to do? Is it pleasurable? Does it feed your soul? And then finally, think about writing. I think writing is, for a lot of us, especially when we get to the dissertation, one of the hardest things to make ourselves do. So if you look back at past events and Ideas on Fire, you'll see a whole bunch of webinars that are sort of about tricking yourself into writing. And that's because for a lot of us, that can be the hardest part. But getting through the dissertation means doing a lot of writing. Is that something that you actually want to do? And if you're completing the PhD with the hopes of an academic job, the writing expectations will just continue to be there, right? Is this something that you actually genuinely enjoy? Because I think it's really important when we reach this phase of deciding whether or not to complete our dissertation to look frankly at what the job is and to ask ourselves, do we want this job? Do I want this job? Do I want to be a teacher? Do I want to be a writer and a researcher and a writer of academic things? If I don't want to do those things, then it's worth thinking about, is it worth finishing the PhD? And then ask yourself why you might want to leave. If you're watching this webinar, chances are you're sort of trying to figure out if it's okay to not finish your PhD. At least that's where I was when I made the decision, made an active decision about finishing the PhD. And there are a lot of reasons to leave, right? All the reasons that you already know, right? You're not finding the writing satisfying, or the research. Why are you writing something hardly anyone will read? What if you can't get a job? Is it really worth it? Is the part where I'm struggling through the dissertation a sign that it's not worth finishing? Those, you need to sort of balance those feelings with the knowledge that everybody at this stage of the dissertation feels this way. Right? Everybody feels like it's hopeless, won't get it done, I'm bored with the project. These are normal feelings, right? So how do you figure out if it's just that, if those are just the normal feelings of frustration at the dissertation level, or if there's signs that you really need to not finish, you really need to go do something else. So ask yourself, is it just that I'm scared to finish? Or is it that I really just don't want this job anymore? And unfortunately, only you will know which of those is true, right? But I will say, once you make the decision, it becomes the truth for you. So those are just some questions to ask yourself as you're trying to figure out whether or not you should bother finishing that dissertation. So there's some things that you'll ask that, these are just some things that I think, if you're wondering about leaving your graduate program, that go through all of our heads, right? Well, I have to finish because I'm so close. I've done all the coursework, passed the prospectus, I've got drafts of 2 chapters, I should just finish, right? The thing with that is that doesn't mean that you have to finish, right? As your Economics 101 teacher would tell you, it's a sunk cost. Like, you put in that time, think about all the things you gained from that time, how many great conversations you've had with smart people, how much you've learned, how it's shaped your worldview. The work is worth it, whether you get that piece of paper at the end or not, right? So just because you're so close doesn't mean you have to finish the dissertation, right? You could decide that this is not a good use of your time and energy and your psychic space. And if that's true, it's okay to not finish, even though you've, quote, come this far, right? Know that you'll be in good company. Lots of people get this close and don't finish. Another feeling that one has is that I feel like a failure, right? If I weren't a failure, I would have finished. It wouldn't have been a big deal. Everybody else in my cohort finished, right? You know, the sort of self-talk you probably do already if you're trying to make this decision. If just want to remind you, you're not a failure if you decide not to finish your PhD. It's a decision that I think is really smart and a good decision for a lot of people, right? And that's part of what I think making an active decision about whether or not to finish can do for you, can stave off this idea that I'll feel like a failure. You know, you're not a failure, you're just making a different choice, right? Then there's the concern that, at least I'm very familiar with, maybe I'm just lazy. I could finish this if I weren't so lazy. If I just sit down and work, but I'm always getting distracted by the internet or TV, or I'm just lazy. You're not just lazy. If everybody struggles with writing at some point, and if the struggle looks a certain way and feels a certain way after a certain amount of time, it's worth listening to what that struggle is telling you, right? And it's not telling you you're lazy. It might be telling you this is the wrong path. And then there's one that can keep us trapped in the dissertation writing phase and not moving forward for a very long time. I should just give it one more semester. Next semester will be the one where I get my shit together and I really make it happen. One more semester, we'll see what happens. At some point, that one more semester goes on for so long that you're adding up years, often years of debt, right? As you sort of fail to make the decision to either stay or to go. So be wary of the one more semester. If you really, give it one more semester, absolutely. But at a certain point, it's worth making a decision to leave. Now, when you're making this this decision, it's, again, it's really, really hard, and it can be hard to trust yourself, I think, especially for a lot of us, after years of being in a PhD program where we're really working ourselves into knots, right? To really know what it is that we want. So it's I think, worth thinking about writing our feelings about this, right? Journaling how we feel each day for a month or something, to see, like, are we changing our mind at all? Is this something we want to do? I would also suggest therapy as a way of finding somebody to talk to who's not invested, right, the way your mom is or your peers are in what you decide to do, but can actually, like, be a good sounding board and help you figure out sort of where you're being honest with yourself and where you're not. And then also career counseling, I think, can be really helpful, because part of the thing that makes it scariest to leave is, what am I going to do instead? Well, I've come this far. It's all I'm good at. It's all I'm trained for. What else could I do? A career counselor can help you figure out what else you could do and take away some of that fear that keeps us trapped finishing dissertations that might not be good for us. So let's talk a little bit about that question of what we could possibly do instead. It isn't the case that the skills you gained in graduate school are useless unless you finish your PhD. So I think it's worth thinking, what do you especially like about graduate school? What keeps you there? For a lot of us, it's teaching. So teaching is, you get a lot of instant feedback from students. You get to have interesting conversations with interesting people. It can feel really valuable. I know for me, as soon as I took chalk and wrote on a chalkboard, I was living out a childhood fantasy. I'd always wanted to be a teacher, and I hadn't known it. So if teaching is sort of what you love about the job, and for a lot of us it is, there are a couple ways to take that knowledge and think about what to do next. One is there a way to think about completing the PhD as earning a teaching certificate for college level teaching? When I was making the decision to complete my PhD, that's what I ultimately decided, that I wanted to have a certificate so that I could teach at the college level if I got a job to teach at the college level. And once I knew that, the pressure of finishing a really quality dissertation lifted, right? I realized it was true. I just needed something good enough to get past my committee so that I could get a teaching certificate. And I never thought, oh, I'm going to go get that big research one job. I was just looking for a place where I could be a teacher. So that's sort of one way to think about, I like teaching. Maybe I'll finish for this teaching certificate. But maybe that's not a good motivator. Maybe teaching at the college level, you look at the job market, looks pretty bad. Where else could I be a teacher? Right? So think about other places you could teach with the qualifications you already have, so that finishing the PhD isn't necessary. And that includes places, if you've got your MA, community colleges, high schools, private high schools that don't require a teaching certificate, or maybe you're interested in getting involved in other kinds of teaching, like training for training programs, running webinars like the one I'm giving right now, like thinking of other ways to put your teaching, get your passion for teaching out there without having to complete your PhD. Now, if the research is what gets you going, for a lot of us, teaching is a drag and is the thing that gets in the way of reading and writing, which is what we really want to do. Then think about how, what are other jobs that require research that don't require a PhD? What is the thing that you like researching? Is there a nonprofit in the world that's looking for a researcher? Are there state jobs, federal jobs for researchers, working in museums, working in libraries? Where else might you be able to use your research skills without having to complete the PhD? You can also think it's worth thinking about, how else can your passion for research be met? For me, once I finished my dissertation and got into full-time teaching, I found that I was curious again in new ways about new things, and I could read and write at my own pace about things that weren't even necessarily related to what I had done in graduate school. And for me, that was incredibly liberating. So remembering that research isn't something that you can only get by completing your PhD is something worth remembering. And maybe what you love is the writing part of this. And for a lot of us, we struggle writing the dissertation, but writing, say, blog posts or writing for a local newspaper or doing kinds of public writing feels more valuable. The feedback one gets from having an actual reading audience that's present can be really rewarding. We can have conversations that we couldn't have just as academic writers. So if that's what you love, you can think about ways that you could use your writing skills as a freelance writer, a journalist, write some other kinds of work. And also remember that there is not a job on this planet that doesn't value a quality writer. So thinking about how you could use your writing skills elsewhere, I think is a great idea. On the other hand, you might decide you want to do something completely different, and that's okay too. So it might be that, and there have been a number of articles in the kind of like alt academic fields lately about this sort of thing, like people who finish their dissertations can't find a job, and so think about, well, what am I really passionate about? I love flowers, getting into flower design, opening a flower shop. Maybe you love working with your hands, and so getting into a plumber's program, right, apprenticeship program, and starting that, right. There's all kinds of ways that we can build a quality life for ourselves outside of graduate school. One thing that, and I think it's sort of ironic, but that graduate school can do is really shut down our imaginations about what our futures and what our worlds can look like. So when you start thinking about fantasizing about what you could do instead, rather than have that be a scary thing that ends with nothing, let that be exciting. And think about all the things that are out there for us to do. So once you've decided what you're going to do, I think it's important to think about how you're going to communicate that decision to people. And I think you should communicate that decision. Well, there's no shoulds. It can be really helpful to communicate that decision, whether it's to finish your PhD or not to finish your PhD. If you have decided not to finish your PhD and you tell your professors, be prepared for them to encourage you to stay. And especially people who've worked with you for years. So often people reach the dissertation phase and really struggle. And it makes sense, right? Because coursework has taught us to write 25 to 35 page papers in a week and not have a lot of time left for revision and editing, turn them in, and be done with the ideas, right? The dissertation is a completely different animal. I remember getting to the dissertation phase and thinking, why didn't anyone prepare me for this? I thought I'd been here for 4 years so that someone could have taught me how to do this, but alas, no. So your professors are used to people struggling at the dissertation phase, but when someone actually decides to leave at the dissertation phase, that can feel threatening to professors, and they can also really want just the retention number of keeping you around, and they probably are invested in you and want you to be successful in the way that they know success looks like, right? Which is getting a tenure-line job like theirs. So they likely will encourage you to stay. And so it's really important to understand why you're leaving and to be able to articulate those reasons and also to stick to your guns about it, right? This is your life and your decision. And hopefully your faculty will be supportive of that. If you decide to stay, I think it's worth communicating. If you're at the point of sort of thinking about whether or not to stay, chances are you've been struggling with the dissertation. If you decide to stay, it can be worth it to communicate that to your faculty, to your advisor, and say, you know what, I really am committed to staying, to completing this dissertation. This is why, and here's my new set of timelines. So for me, when I decided to stay and complete my PhD, I recommitted to a different set of timelines than I'd been on, and I completed with some speed, actually, once I'd sort of made that decision. So making the decision can be really, and communicating it to your faculty can be helpful either way. Now, talking to peers, to fellow graduate students can be really, really challenging, especially if they're people you're close to. And it's, I think, important to be prepared for a wide range of responses. Some people will applaud And be like, oh, you're getting out, congratulations. This is so exciting. Like, I'm so jealous. I wish I was that brave, things like that. And it's a way, I think, of taking your decision and sort of reflecting it back on oneself, right? On, that your peers will do that. And I think it's because we often are threatened by the decisions other people make, especially when we're in pressure cooker environments like graduate school where there's a lot of competition. So if you just say, I'm going to leave the ball on the court and go home, that can leave people feeling very unsettled. So you'll get a wide range of responses. Some people will, might withdraw from you. Some people will be supportive. Some people will try to talk you into staying. And so again, remember that it's your decision, not theirs, but also their decisions are theirs and not yours, right? So if other people don't decide to leave or decide to stay in a different way, it isn't about you, right? So communicating to peers can be hard and can be helpful to have friends outside of graduate school who will likely, they may have strong feelings about it, but chances are it's not the same kind of world-ending decision or world-changing decision that it is for your graduate school colleagues. In terms of explaining to family, this can be really tough, especially if family's been supporting you and hope and waiting, and every like holiday season asking you like, so when are you going to finish? When are we going to have a doctor in the family? That can be really, really tough to explain why you're deciding not to stay in graduate school. If you decide to stay in graduate school, it can be a good time to say, hey, I've recommitted to this and I'm going to finish up this year. Right? Can be good. That can be very comforting to some family, but be prepared for them not to understand. For a lot of us in interdisciplinary graduate programs, our families have never understood, so we might gratefully be used to it, but that can be an issue, so just be prepared for it. And making the decision to leave or to stay, just the idea that we are active deciders in our future is sort of wild and new for a lot of people. But this question of where do we find company? I think it's really important to remember that you're not alone. If you decide not to finish your PhD, you will join a large group of people who left at the ABD stage or who left earlier, who did a year in grad school and decided never mind. My entering cohort in my graduate program, 3 people did not complete the PhD out of an entering class of 8. Right, so it's actually that's just one program. It's very common. You will find yourself in good company. I think it's important if you decide to leave and not to finish your PhD to surround yourself with supporters, people who are not secretly trying to talk you into going back or have a kind of schadenfreude about it, but people who are actually your supporters. And that might be colleagues from grad school and it might not be, but be open to other communities. It can also be helpful to read the growing field of Quitlet, so people's blog posts and essays and stories about deciding to leave their PhD programs or to leave academia after completing a PhD. It can be helpful because you can get a sense of how other people cope with the range of feelings, right? Because even if you do decide and you're happy with your decision to leave, you'll have feelings about leaving a career that you thought was the right one for you. So seeing how other people negotiate that stuff can be really helpful. So read it until it doesn't, or until it doesn't help, because sometimes it can be overwhelming and other people's emotions about leaving can feel so inflated that that doesn't actually help, right? So if reading that stuff doesn't help, then don't read it. And remember that your story is your own. The decision that you made was yours, and that's all you need to know that it's the right one. If you've decided to leave graduate school without finishing your PhD, you can find company by investing in your time and money in your new career, right? So, and sort of looking forward to what's next. So that might mean looking around for a local freelance union if you decide to be a freelance writer, or taking classes at your local tool library to learn construction skills, or whatever it is that, if you decide to go into copy editing, like taking a course and maybe meeting some other people in online copy editing communities. there are all kinds of places where people are gathering and working on careers that aren't this one that you're in right now. So find those people and invest in yourself in terms of time and training as you sort of think about next steps. And you will form new communities of supporters just through that process. If you decide to stay and finish your PhD, I think it's really important at the point of making that decision to make a plan to actually finish. And I'm sure that we've all made plans before to get to the dissertation phase, but making a plan that says, okay, I've decided why I'm finishing, right, is for the teaching certificate. It's because I want to be able to say I did this, because having this piece of paper is important to me for this host of reasons. Right? Once you have a clear idea of why you're finishing, that can really help push you to actually finish, right? And so to make the plan to get through those last steps. So whether you decide to stay or go, you want to look forward. What's next, right? And realize that you've made the decision. Doesn't mean you can't check back with the decision, but once you've made the decision, move forward and make plans for that new future. So I wanted to end the webinar today by pointing you to some other resources if you are looking for company or ways to sort of build the life after you make the decision. If you decide to stay in graduate school, Ideas on Fire has a number of webinars that might be helpful. Our webinar on mapping your semester will help you make a plan to get a lot of writing done. If you're at the dissertation phase, getting that writing done next semester is a priority to get you out of here. We have a great webinar on setting your writing routine, sort of get yourself back in the groove of writing if that's what's become difficult at the dissertation phase. And then also a webinar on building your professional community that encourages you and teaches you how to make connections outside of graduate school so that you can have a broader professional community for when you're done, right? That can help guide you into a variety of different jobs with that PhD. If you decide to leave, just hyperlink to a few things that might be helpful there. We have a webinar on using side gigs to explore career options that talks about how to find freelance writing jobs, how to figure out what makes sense as a different kind of job after academia. This webinar on prepping for an all-tac post-tac career in graduate school. While it assumes that you're going to complete the PhD, if you decide not to complete your PhD, these tips for preparing that for that new career, I think will be really helpful. And then also, if you started writing your dissertation, thinking about how to use that dissertation to find a different kind of career can be really helpful. So this last one on using your dissertation to build a non-academic career, I think would be useful no matter what decision you're making. So those are that's our webinar for today, and I'm going to now return to the screen and see what you all are thinking. Hi, I'm back, and I was just wondering if folks had any questions or thoughts or ways that they've decided or thought about making these kinds of decisions. So there's a box right there if you want to type any comments in. So I'll just sit with the silence for a few minutes, and then if nobody wants to pipe in, I will bid you all farewell. Have a sip of seltzer. Well, I hope that you all, that everyone watching this makes the decision. Oh, there you are. That makes the decision of, how to make this decision. And yeah, the working on the proposal and feeling that apprehension about beginning again. Yeah, it can be really scary. Yeah, and I wasn't good at anything else. That's why I went to graduate school too. And finding a job can be really, is really hard, right? And so one goes to graduate school sometimes almost just because. And it's really, really hard to make the decision. And I think if you do actively think about and make the decision, you will be one in a very small group that isn't just going through the motions for the whole of one's academic life. And whatever decision you make, I think makes the idea that you have some agency over it and you're not just, going through the motions will be really helpful. All right, well, good luck to all of you in making this decision, whatever it is. And hopefully we'll see you at one of our upcoming webinars. We have upcoming webinars about setting summer goals. And then also I'll be doing a webinar about how to move, because moving sucks and I'd like to make it easier. All right, so have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you next time.